6:30 this afternoon, 20 boats were spotted heading across the rough Gulf Stream waters toward Key West. Some of the boats were being escorted across the straits by Navy and Coast Guard ships. Others formed a convoy of their own for protection. There are reports that the Cuban government has ordered an end to the refugee sea lift. All boats were to have left Mariel by today.
In 1980, South Florida witnessed a wave of humanity arriving by sea, beginning the event we now know as the Mariel Boatlift. The Mariel Boatlift, one of the most massive migrations the United States has ever seen, carried over 125,000 struggling but hopeful Cuban refugees who were desperate for rights and responsibilities lacked in their homeland. These asylum seekers fled to South Florida mainly because of the political and economic instabilities in their native country. This huge migration caused many problems for the United States government, shaping immigration policies and public perceptions of migrants, especially in the South Florida region. Although they had the same rights as any other American, migrants were socially stigmatized by the American public. This created immense pressure for what rights immigrants should be able to have, leading to it becoming a major issue in American politics and entitling migrants to responsibilities they should have as human beings. Through the alienation of Cuban refugees, their rights as immigrants and humans were undermined, while the Americans' responsibility to provide humanitarian aid remained.
To fully understand the context of the Mariel Boatlift, we must first understand what led to the mass Cuban migration. After the 1959 Cuban Revolution, a socialist government was imposed by Fidel Castro and his regime, which forced widespread suppression of civil rights. Not only did Castro suppress civil rights, but he also eliminated political rivals, took full control of the press, and forced the undesirables, including political rivals, homosexuals, religious believers, and others deemed counter-revolutionary. For those who opposed Castro, life became unbearable and looked for a way to escape. The U.S. became a desirable destination for tens of thousands of Cubans starving for their rights back, not only because of its close proximity, but also its long-standing opposition to the communist regime at home. The U.S. welcomed these refugees with open arms, and soon Castro took advantage of the U.S.'s hospitality by famously declaring to his nation, "We do not want them, we do not need them," revealing later that if they wanted to leave, they could leave from the port of Mariel.
Al esfuerzo y al heroísmo de una revolución, no los queremos, no los necesitamos.
On April 1st, 1980, 6 disillusioned asylum-seeking Cubans crashed a bus into the Peruvian embassy in an effort to breach it and stay as refugees. After years of worsening conditions within Cuba and relations to the United States, a disconnect occurred in the hearts of many whom the revolution was developed for. Facing inconsistent Cuban narratives and a weak economy, a spark was lit under the intimidated public, and the 6 Cubans who fled to the embassy grew to 10,856. Hoping for a different life, it appeared as though the utopian system of Cuba was unwanted by its own people. The narrative was flipped on embassy refugees, and they were labeled as escortia, the scum of the society. The Peruvian government did not hand them over, and 2 weeks later, Castro announced the Mariel Boatlift. The U.S. relatives and exiles rushed to pick up Cuban hopefuls in private and hired boats.
So all of a sudden there was an incident with an embassy, like a few people, Cuban, tried to leave, and they basically broke into the embassy asking for asylum. Things get out of hands. Before you know, and this is what I remember, they start telling those said bad people, they killed the soldiers of the revolution. Later on, it turned out to be a false. They killed each other because they crossed fire and they tried to kill the civilians breaking into the embassy. They were unarmed.
As Cuban refugees arrived in waves in the U.S., Cubans and Americans questioned what their rights would look like under both American and international law. One right was guaranteed. According to the international agreements, individuals are allowed to seek asylum when fleeing political persecution. For most Cubans, escaping from Fidel Castro's regime was a matter of survival. Seeking protection in the U.S., they sought political asylum, hoping to gain the right to freedom they never got in Cuba. However, innocent refugees weren't the only people set out to live in America. There were also Cuban prisoners and psychiatric patients released by Fidel Castro to burden the U.S. This led to intense debates within the U.S. on what should qualify for asylum. On one hand, there was a responsibility to aid the people fleeing from Castro's oppression, while on the other hand, the American public grew concerned over a variety of refugees considered as security risks. Fidel Castro labeling them as undesirables shaped public opinion of both countries and policies in future U.S. decisions, trying to balance humanitarian rights and national security.
So that image was put out there by the Cuban media, and a lot of people in Cuba picked that up, right? That the people that were inside the embassy and that the people that left in the Mariel Boatlift were all criminals. And that was eventually picked up by the American media as well. Mm-hmm. And the American media ran with that image. They, up to a certain extent, there was a little bit of truth in what they were saying, that the people that were arriving in the Mariel Boatlift were criminals because of the fact that Fidel Castro opened the prisons and allowed all the prisoners and all the people that he didn't want to leave. However, having said that, most of the people that left in the Mariel Boatlift, and I can tell you that because I've done the research and I wrote the book, where I would say 80% were just regular people that wanted to leave the country.
In addition to these rights being granted, although debated by some, the federal government and those in South Florida had to step up. They had a humanitarian obligation to do so. When Cuba declared itself a socialist state in 1961, America became wary and watchful. Conflicts like the Bay of Pigs invasion, the U.S. embargo, and the Cuban Missile Crisis arose. While America tried to contain the spread of communism in the West, their ideological conflict was not without consequences. The Cuban people and their economy would suffer as a result of American actions, no matter how justified in theory, and when they finally seek refuge from their repressive regime, the moral responsibility falls on America, who took it upon themselves to constrain communism in the first place. U.S. President Jimmy Carter and his open hearts, open borders policy played a key role in allowing this event to happen, but its execution was not flawless, one of its biggest mistakes being the lack of screening centers, leading to criminals slipping into America. The Coast Guard was used to secure these borders, yet many of these flotillas were able to slip past. Despite this, over 1,400 ships were seized, and government efforts came forward to aid Cuban migrants in need.
I think Jimmy Carter, I am eternally grateful, and all I can say is that I'm very thankful. I know a lot of people thought he was a very weak president, that Fidel Castro took advantage of him. Maybe there's some truth to that, but I can tell you that he was a very human, you know what I mean, a very noble person that was willing to help.
We can see the effects these migrants have on local communities even before the boatlift officially started. In a speech given by a Miami Refugee Center director, Marshall Wise, he speaks on how Cubans should not be looked down upon or separated. Many locals feared the destruction that Cubans might cause. This speech was given in May of 1963, and although so many years before the boatlift, we can see the views Americans had on Cubans. Miami did later see a growth in population as well as a rise in crime rates, but fears were heightened with stereotyping news, coverage, and media. 2 years after the boatlift, the 1983 film Scarface, and its violent, drug-riddled depictions of Cuban people, was an instance of this negative portrayal. In reality, only 2,500 of the 125,000 were speculated to be criminals. So few transported during the event had either been arrested or had some kind of psychological issue back in Cuba, but their image would be tarnished further. The difference between other migrant groups and the Marielitos makes it hard to compare their actions to others, and the event changed the future of American public safety and security during the migration.
The Mariel Boatlift was a very degrading event for Cubans and all immigrants. Today, over 50% of Miami residents are Cuban. This would have never been possible without the Mariel Boatlift. Cubans, although unwelcomed at first, have settled into South Florida, with now owning thousands of businesses. There's even a section of Miami called Little Havana, and there are many monuments and art pieces either created for or by Cubans. Even today, many immigration rights are discussed, such as building a border wall across the southwest states of America. These topics have and will continue to arise, although America originally started a country of immigrants. Throughout its long history, migrants have been viewed in many different ways, as well as provided or not provided basic rights written in the Constitution.